welcome to God is Open. I am your host, Christopher Fisher, and today we got Dr. Rhoda on the program. I force everyone at this point to say hi.
Hi. Howdy.
There we go.
Howdy, y'all.
So tell us a little about yourself. Some guy in the comments says, "Who is this guy? He's a mystery man."
Well, my name is Rhoda. I've got a PhD in philosophy from Fordham University, and I worked as a philosopher for about 10 years, jumping around between a few different institutions. My last one was at Notre Dame, but I eventually had to leave the profession to find a job that would actually pay me enough to support my family. So I became a librarian. And fortunately, the job field there is far, far superior to that in academic humanities fields. But I've got somewhere close to 20 of my papers have been published in academic journals or edited collections. And I just came out with my first book. It's a short little book, but I think it's a good one. It's on open theism. And I've been thinking hard about questions of divine providence and foreknowledge and freedom for, I'd say since I was an undergraduate. If I can date myself, that would be about I don't know, about 35 years ago now. And over the years of working through undergraduate school and then grad school and working on my dissertation and everything, which was not in philosophy of religion, but in epistemology, I moved through kind of all of the standard positions that there are on that. And one by one, I just concluded that this just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And I found myself at late 1990s. I was starting work on my dissertation, and I had on my own. I was thinking that, how can you mesh God and future contingency? How do you mix God and contingency together? And I was, after ruling out Molinism and Calvinism and the other views, it seemed to me the only way that it could possibly work is if God deliberately leaves the future open in some sense. And I didn't know how to articulate it then. It was about a year after I started thinking along those lines that I stumbled upon, just by accident, a book by John Sanders called The God Who Risks. And then that led me to another book by Greg Boyd called God at War. And from there, I discovered a discussion board hosted by Greg Boyd called the Open Theism Discussion Board. It's no longer in operation, hasn't been for some time, but for the next 8 to 10 years or so, I was very active on that board, interacted a lot with Greg and with some of the other smart people on there, like Tom Belt and others. And that led to my collaborating on a paper with Greg and Tom, and which was my first publication that came out in Faith and Philosophy on, I forget the exact title, but the point was kind of about the openness of God is tied into how we think about the nature of the future. And so you have to kind of think about both issues together if you're to make sense of it. And that's led me through the intervening years to write a number of other type pieces on trying to articulate open theism and trying to distinguish a number of different senses in which the openness of the future can be cashed out, so that I can say, well, what kind of openness do you need to affirm to be an open theist, or how does it compare and contrast with other models like Molinism or simple foreknowledge, and what are the ontological commitments of these views and things like that. And in my most recent book, I finally put together an argument that I think is sound to making the case that if the future is causally open, which is to say that determinism is false, that indeterminism of some sort is true, and there are events that both can happen and can not happen. So it's a two-sided possibility. If the future is causally open, then it's got to be basically just open across the board. There can't be any such thing as a unique actual future in any sense, if you grant that premise of future contingency. If I'm right about that, and if some form of monotheism is true, then I think open theism is left as literally the only game in town. All the other views wind up being internally inconsistent at some point.
Well, yeah, I think that's pretty obviously true. So James says he loves the thumbnail. So the thumbnail for this, of course, is if this man knows what open theism is, why is he wearing Hawaiian shirts? And I made a special edit for our intro tonight of all the Hawaiian shirts in probably the best Shakespeare adaptation, the Romeo and Juliet starring Leonardo DiCaprio. Maybe that or Kenneth Branagh's Macbeth is probably two of the best adaptations. So, of course, you're probably paying homage to Romeo and Juliet, right?
Paying homage to them?
With the Hawaiian shirt, of course.
Oh. I don't know. Was there a Hawaiian shirt in Shakespeare's play? I'm not quite following
it. In the Leonardo DiCaprio adaptation set
in
Rhoda, they're all wearing Hawaiian shirts.
You know what? Honestly, I haven't seen it, so I kind of went whoosh over my head.
No, not watching Shakespeare. Well, we could all agree that that's the best adaptation. But right. I used to wear these Hawaiian shirts in high school because it was like popular to have like that stoner look where you're hunched over and then you got like some sort of plaid shirt on or something like that. And for the life of me, I can't find any of them in my house. I don't have them anymore. They've all disappeared. I don't think I own a Hawaiian shirt, but I tried to find one for tonight and failed miserably.
Well, the one you put on your thumbnail is the one I decided to wear tonight, and this just happens to be my favorite Hawaiian shirt. So I'm glad you put that one on your thing rather than
very festive.
I have about half a dozen of them, but
for a festive book. So here we go. It's a Cambridge Elements, Religion and Monotheism, Open Theism. So were you contacted to write this book? Did you reach out to them and offer? How did that come about?
I reached out to them. I'd been noticing people posting on Facebook for some time, for over a year, about new about new books in the Cambridge Elements type series that were coming out and promoting these books and things. And I took a look at the series at the info page on the Cambridge website for it, and I saw how it was broken down into all these sub-series. One of them is Religion and Monotheism, and I was thinking, you know what, I'd really like to write some kind of a book on open theism, because I've done lots of articles on it, but I really need to do something a bit more substantial, gives me a little more space to work with, and I can I decided to send an email to the editors of this series and I explained what I had in mind, and they said, you know what, we like that idea. We just have a couple things we want to make sure you do. Since this is like a monotheism series, you can't focus exclusively on Christianity. It's got to be broader than that. And so I made sure to include references to Judaism and Islam and kind of just generic monotheism at certain points. But it took me about a year to write the book, and I'm pretty happy with the final product. It's not perfect, but I think it's pretty good overall. And at least according to Bill Hasker, who was one of the referees on it, it's the best articulation in defense of open theism to date. So.
Well, here's a story. I took my kids yesterday, my 4 oldest kids, and not the little tiny ones, and I sat them down and we flipped to your chapter on philosophical support, and we went through line by line the logical syllogism or whatnot, and their response was, "This is really boring."
I don't. Did you take them through the 22-line argument?
I did. I'm not gonna that. Okay. We maybe got to like step 7 on the 20-line argument. Sometimes it feels like you're trying to prove things that are just obviously not true. You're like, there's a belief out there that believes that the future is open, but it also has truth values. And then you're like, well, let's consider this view and see if that's rational or not. Whereas like normal people be like, obviously that's false. Obviously a view with a contingent future is incompatible with one with future truth values. It's just,
yeah.
Can't we just dismiss it? Does it have to be a step in the argument? Isn't it just obvious?
You might think it's obvious, but in fact, there are lots and lots of really smart people who want to insist that that sort of view where the future is partly open, the open in some respects and is settled in other respects, that's a coherent mix to have. And if I were to just say, well, it's just obvious that you're wrong, nobody would take me seriously, and my book would never have passed peer review.
Yeah, it feels like it's like you introduce a step and then you just pull back the step right away, and it's like, well, I guess. But it's like Molinists will do this. They'll say, all these futures are possible, but they can never occur. They can never actualize. It's like, is that what possible means? That seems to be the opposite of possible. That's impossible with 0% chance of happening. And so, they do exist. And my kids got a thorough rundown of the Molinistic arguments yesterday.
Okay.
And so they were none too thrilled for that either. But
well, especially if your kids are young, I can't imagine young kids having the degree of, I guess, attention span that would be required for following a complex argument.
Yeah, it tends to be that kids don't care about something until it becomes relevant. And so I might not care when I was a kid about Bible studies until you start engaging with other Christians who start arguing things. And then you're like, okay, well, I know a little something about this. Maybe I should have taken some of these things more seriously so I can engage a little bit better, something like that. So that's why you introduce physical punishment if they're not listening, to get them motivated.
Beatings will continue until morale improves.
Learn these philosophical arguments. Well, they did start understanding how these logical syllogism formulas work. When I told them basically any proposition, you can put in any propositions. At the end, you could challenge whether those propositions are true or not. But if they logically follow, it's a logically valid syllogism.
Yeah.
And so they did learn a little bit about the flow of arguments. So that was pretty good.
Very good.
You start off, this is a book about open theism, and it's supposed to be the definitive definition of open theism. So what is open theism?
Well, I'll explain it in 2 ways. First, I'll give my kind of the spiel I would give to somebody who is not a philosopher, who is just your average Joe or whatever, I would explain it by saying that what open theism is it's the view that, well, of course, that there is a God, but that God approaches or perceives the future as open-ended, to some extent, just like we do. And he does this because the future really is open-ended. And why is it open-ended? Because God wanted it that way. God decided he didn't want to be a all-controlling micromanager. He decided he wanted to delegate some responsibilities to his creatures and leave them the freedom of following through or not. So that's my sort of technical way of trying to
Right. It doesn't seem
explain
like the
open theism.
Bible has that mental process described in God. And so it's
Mhm.
a philosophical assumption that God chose to create the world in such a way that free will exists rather than it being just the default. And it wasn't even a consideration of God to make robots that are micromanagely controlled with no individual volition. It
Mhm.
doesn't seem to even cross God's mind in the Bible.
Yeah, yeah. Of course, perhaps a lot of that deliberation happens behind the scenes, before uh, Genesis 1:1.
Right. It could be
We're
the
not
case.
privy to all that, perhaps, but
Yeah, but it doesn't
um,
seem. And then God seems to learn about man throughout the Bible. Like he calls the animals to Adam, and you point this out in your book. That's one of your biblical proofs to see what Adam's going to call these animals. And so it's future contingencies that God's experiencing in real time.
mhm.
And
Yeah.
so yeah,
Oh
go
yeah.
ahead.
Well, I didn't want to interrupt your train, but the more sort of technical way of defining open theism that I uh, pursue in the book, because this is intended to be a philosophical analysis and defense of open theism. Um, as I say, open theism is a combination of 5 claims. The first one I refer to as minimal monotheism, which is just kind of or at least what I take to be a fairly non-controversial, kind of bare bones statement of monotheism. And then it includes like 3 claims about the future, or the openness of the future. The future is causally open. The future is epistemically open for God, and is providentially open, which is to say, God is not a micromanager. And then the last claim is simply uh, that it is impossible for the future to be epistemically open if it is causally open. So in other words, God couldn't have arranged things such that he could have his cake and eat it too here. He can't make a universe with creatures that are genuinely free and have everything scripted out at the same time, either in his mind or in the causal sequence or in the ontology of time or any way. So the incompatibility claim is kind of what uh, ensures that if God wants creaturely freedom, he kind of has to accept uh, you know a a robustly open future.
Hmm. And so Thomas J. Ord took a little bit of issue to your book where he
Hmm.
objected that uh, counting creation ex nihilo as basic monotheism excludes him, and he's like, it's a good book except for this little part here because it seems so. He
Yeah.
did take issue on that. I might take issue. I don't know. Like, let's pretend someone shared every single view you had, but had creation from something rather than nothing. Would they not be a basic monotheist?
Um, I would say that they would not be. I think creation ex nihilo is essential for um, we might call it kind of a to be a monotheist in the full sense of the term. Um, so let me just take one step back. So The way I defined my notion of minimal monotheism, I start out with the kind of like the general claims that there is one God who is personal, who exists necessarily, who is maximally excellent with respect to goodness and power and knowledge, and upon whom all other things ultimately depend for their existence. And then I add a sentence at the end of that, and this is what Tom Ord was specifically objecting to, where I say God can unilaterally intervene in creation, uh, uh, at his own discretion, and he creates the world ex nihilo, from nothing. Uh, Tom, being a process theist, obviously objects to that. He doesn't think creation ex nihilo is true, and he doesn't think God can unilaterally intervene in creation at all. That all of God's interactions with creation are, all of them are multilateral. It's a negotiation, as it were, between God and free creatures. Um, so the reason I add that last clause there was specifically to exclude process theism from uh, uh, from the sort of theism that open theism is concerned with. Uh, uh, the reason I do that is because I want to maintain a clear distinction between open theism and process theism. And my reason for wanting to maintain that distinction is because it seems to me that if you look at the kind of the modern, well, the works written by the people who I refer to as the founders of the modern open theism movement, which are the five authors of the Pinnock book on the openness of God, and Greg Boyd. They were all kind of there writing at about the same time in the mid to in the 90s and the early 2000s, and were these seminal kind of like books on open theism that have kind of been recognized as like standard texts, and they all agreed that we're not process folks. We God could have completely determined the whole history of creation had he wanted to, but God didn't want to do that, and it's not really any good reason for God to want to do that. But uh, um,
So I'd sent you a name of a book by Roy Kindleberg, and
mhm,
yeah, you don't have to have read the book or anything like that, but it's God's
I have it.
absence and the charismatic presence. And in this book, he argues that like God is repelled by sin, and so God. He states that in the Sodom and Gomorrah text that we see in the Bible, where the reports are coming to God, and then God goes down to see if the reports which come to him are true. He states that's because God is repelled by sin, so he doesn't even necessarily have that knowledge there because there's a sin rejection. Would you consider something like his view in your model concerning power and knowledge? Would you consider him as a basic monotheist?
Well, if he can defend the restrictions uh, on kind of knowledge and power as well, so the way I framed it was that God is maximally excellent with respect to power, knowledge, and goodness. And later on in my book, I give a little more clarification to that, and I say that that God's going to have these qualities to the highest degree possible, subject to the need for internal consistency. So if he can make a halfway plausible argument, at least by his own lights, why the restrictions he wants to place are necessary to preserve internal consistency, then I think he's got at least you know, uh, a a defense he can offer. I don't find his proposal particularly plausible. It strikes me as quite implausible. I'd rather say that what uh, you know uh, just as uh, light doesn't flee from darkness, but darkness flees from light, right? When you turn the light on, it's the darkness that leaves the room, not the um, um, that God, I think, is, he knew exactly what possibilities he was uh, um, could come about by giving his creatures the freedom and the powers that he did. So I see no reason why God should be at all squeamish about this kind of stuff. And uh, I would prefer to say that uh, it's the manifestation of God's presence that is hidden from sinful creatures. It's not that God isn't there, but that, and perhaps in the text of Sodom and Gomorrah, maybe it's written that way to kind of uh, make a point about how uh, God is. Well, I'm not sure how to articulate it, but
Some people say it's about a future test to see if they're going to continue in those ways. So that's
yeah,
a traditional reading of it that is plausible. But okay,
yeah,
so I
um,
was in the debate, and the debate's on open theism, and I start out. Wikipedia defines open theism as a rejection of the synthesis of Greek philosophy and Christian theology. And lo and behold, right after the debate, Wikipedia was changed, and someone put like a little number there saying citation needed. And so I went and found a citation to go quick throw there. But I thought that's a particularly good definition. In your book, your definition focuses on God and his relationship and knowledge with the future, but it does eventually touch on the rejection of divine and simplicity, timelessness, immutability, impassibility,
mhm,
all those types of Platonistic attributes. So, what's
yeah.
the thought process why we are the definition of open theism is being focused on the nature of God's knowledge of the future rather than the rejection holistically of Platonistic simplicity?
Yeah, my thinking there is that, uh, well, as you know, with any kind of attempt to define a concept, the, what you're trying to do is in as sort of efficient a way and clear a way as possible to carve nature at its joints, uh, and to find um, the distinctions that will do the most work for you, right? So that you don't have this long, extensive kind of definition, and you can keep it short and relatively concise, and exclude all the things you're hoping to exclude. And so my thinking is that uh, open theism, as I see it, is not primarily a model of God, but a model of divine providence. Uh, uh, the classical attributes, of simplicity and timelessness, that's more appropriate to a model of God. And uh, if we're thinking about divine providence, which is kind of how God relates to creation, right? How God provides for or manages creation, all the different things God, does in that interaction. Um, if uh, if well, the way I lay it out, so like my definition of minimal monotheism, as including creation ex nihilo and such, is intended to exclude process theism. Uh, my next point, which was affirming the causal openness of the future, is intended to exclude theistic determinism. The point about the epistemic openness of the future excludes all the other views uh, except process theism, right? And the one about the providential openness excludes both theistic determinism and Molinism. Um, so each of those claims is doing work in kind of trying to of excluding one or more of the main competitors to open theism as a model of divine providence. Had I started with saying that open theism is a denial of divine simplicity, well, that doesn't by itself exclude anything except hardcore classical theism. It doesn't exclude theistic determinism. It doesn't exclude monism. It doesn't exclude simple foreknowledge, and it doesn't exclude the timeless knowledge view. It 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 doesn't move me that far, I think, toward getting clear on what open theism is, in contrast to all these other positions. So it seemed to me that
it could be a rhetorical win. In James DeWezel's book, I think it's his All That Is in God, he calls Norman Geisler a theistic mutable. No, I think it was Bruce Ware he calls a theistic mutabilist, and says he's basically an open theist because he endorses passions in God, emotions in God.
yeah,
And so
that's
it maybe moving the needle, telling people that they are open theists because of their views and forcing them to confront it, it might be a good open theist strategy.
maybe you could argue, though it would take some argument to show this, that if you take that one step of breaking out of the classical straitjacket, that you're on a slippery slope that's implicitly headed toward open theism. Maybe that's true, but that's going to take some work to convince people of that. Um, um, anyway, it seemed to me that the clearest and most efficient way to distinguish open theism from the neighboring views that it's competing with, uh, uh, it was to focus on the different ways in which the openness or settledness of the future can be understood. And then once we see what open theism is committed to, we can see that this is going to entail a denial of all of those standard classical attributes. You cannot affirm absolute simplicity, absolute immutability, timelessness, or absolute impassibility. You can maybe affirm some sort of watered down or weakened version of simplicity, like replace absolute simplicity with divine unity. God is a non-sort of decomposable being, or divine immutability. Well, this is just talking about the unchangeability of God's essence. God cannot become less or more perfect than he is. Or something like that.
So you write that all open theists hold that the future is causally open. So what does that entail?
Well, as I say it it means that there are multiple causally possible futures, where a causally possible future is where, well, first of all, by a future, I mean a complete extension of the actual past and present. So if you
So, but
imagine all the ways things could go from here on,
right,
right?
and that would
You
be
have this.
completely abstract if presentism's true, correct?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So you can imagine these continuations of history extending from now till until kingdom come, till the end of time, if there is an end of time. Um, and each of those could define a future. Now, are any of those futures possible? Well, um, that depends on what constraints you have in place. I mean, what determines what's possible and what's not. As far as the causal openness or what causally possible futures, I say that the constraints are kind of the causal constraints. So whatever this system of natural laws uh, and powers that God has fashioned. Some things are simply not causally possible, like at least as we currently understand it. It's say not possible for, say, us to accelerate an object beyond the speed of light, right? Or it's not possible for me, or to jump from here to the surface of the moon. I would destroy myself in the process. My body can't handle that kind of the force that would be required to do that. Um, uh,
So
there's lots. Yeah.
I do find a
Oh.
rhetorical trick that's used by Molinists is that they
Mhm.
claim something is possible if they could just conceive it happening. It's possible that your kid was born 2 pounds heavier. It's possible that you would have wrote one book rather than another because they could conceive that. But in their model of
Yeah.
time, there's actually not a possibility of those things ever occurring. There's no chance of those happening because there's
Right.
one set future. And you do talk about this in your book, how those models give you a set truth values for all events in the future, that there's going to be one unique actual future, which
Uh-huh.
precludes the possibility of any other future.
Um, well, it depends what you mean by possible here, right? Okay, so
So,
uh,
real quick story. I wrote on a
yeah.
webpage once on it, like I think it was like Soteriology 101. I said, if something has zero chance of happening, it has zero probability, then it is not possible. It's impossible. And the first comment was, only an open theist would believe this.
Well, if by possible there you mean that it's not causally possible, I think that's right. I think one good way to analyze or explicate the concept of causal possibilities by using the probabilistic notion of chance, where a chance is generally understood as a single case objective probability. It's grounded in kind of the natures of the concrete things, right? So, in terms of, say, the nature of a pair of dice, how it's shaped, how it's weighted, how it's thrown, the surface it lands on, all those variables, there is a certain chance that the pips land up a certain way, like that you get a 7, right? There's a chance that you get a different number. Uh, if the chance of some event happening is between the extremes of 0 and 1, then we could say that is the future is causally open with respect to that event. There is a conceivable future in which that event occurs one way, and or it occurs, and another conceivable future in which it doesn't occur at all. And so it's the future is sort of open with respect to that event. It's an um, um, I think what the person objecting to your comment was probably uh, well, or the Molinists you were referring to a minute ago, they're probably thinking primarily of what we might refer to as a metaphysical possibility.
Yeah, an
Or
ad hoc
uh,
category that seems to be like
yeah,
a rationalization of their system.
yeah, there are a number of I guess degrees of possibility, starting with like uh, things that are like logically possible in the very kind of strict, like formal proof sense. It's possible if it can't be formally disproven. Then there's a slightly weaker, or uh, the I'm not sure if I want to say weaker, stronger sense of possibility, um, where it just has to be internally consistent, which may not be provable, as we know from the incompleteness theorems and stuff like this. Not everything that's possible is provably, you know, can be proved. can be proven as such.
So,
So
when
some things
oh,
are,
go ahead.
and then you have what I like to call abstract kind of metaphysical possibility, which requires not only that there be internal coherence, but it also builds in additional information about the natures of the things involved. So, and then you can go from there to a concrete version of metaphysical possibility, which builds in not just information about the natures of things, but also their actual kind of disposition. So at each stage of the possibility hierarchy, you're adding in more and more information that further constrains what's possible and what's not. And I think causal possibility is on the same level as what I like to think of as concrete metaphysical possibility. The
Yeah. So
Molinists are working in the abstract, in terms of abstract metaphysical possibility. So they're just spinning these just so stories out of their heads that aren't grounded in anything real.
right,
And that's what I think you're objecting to.
I showed my kids the quote from Richard Dawkins. Now he's an atheist and he doesn't believe in free will. And his
Mhm.
quote is basically that all things that we experience are based on antecedent events. So in his mind, in his system, his atheist system, there's no free will. Everything is fated, and
Mhm.
our notion that's inherent within all of us. I asked all my kids, "Do you guys think you have volition? Do you think you have free will?" They all said yes. Dawkins thinks that that's just a delusion, but I pointed out to them that Dawkins' system is basically the Molinist model, because the information in Molinism, where God decides to create a world that will actualize 100% without error, without any variance, that has to operate under the same mechanics where everything is based on antecedent events, or else you have God knowing information about free will creatures before they exist to make those choices. They're not the ones making those choices. They didn't originate those
Mhm.
choices. They don't even exist to make those choices. So the model
Yeah.
has to operate like Richard Dawkins' atheist model, where antecedent events inputs into our human coding spit predefined outputs.
Yeah. I think you're right about that. There is an internal inconsistency at the heart of Molinism. It's um, uh, it 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 assumes that there is completely determinate information about what every possible creature would do in any indeterministic choice situation, uh, and that this information is available to God completely independently of whether there ever are any creatures at all. Uh, which means that the creature cannot be responsible for God having that information. The information exists independently of like you or me. So if it's determinately the case and known infallibly by God that if Chris is placed in a certain specified circumstance, he would do this specific thing, and you have no say over the truth of that counterfactual, then it's and we've stipulated that counterfactual is true and infallibly known by God. Then I don't see how you could still be free under those circumstances. The system it entails a kind of fatalism, even though Molinists will deny that because they'll say we are libertarians and stuff. But it's just because they're inconsistent, they can't affirm both sides of their system at the same time, and so they have to keep switching
It's a shell
between
game.
the different parts of the system. Yeah, it's a shell game, exactly.
Yeah. So,
Um,
my next question was about, we talked a little bit about the unique actual future, which
mhm.
I think one of the brilliant things about the paper is giving terms to a lot of these concepts that don't appear to have terms otherwise. Did you
Mhm.
originate this, or is it just standard terminology?
Well, I owe it. the phrase unique actual future to Patrick Todd. He introduced that in one of his papers that I read, and I thought that was an appropriate uh, uh, phrase to use to capture the idea that there is some one particular way that the future is for sure going to go. It's and um, and hence, on the standard view of divine foreknowledge, God knows that. He has God eternally knows this unique actual future, and that's what it means for him to have foreknowledge.
So yeah, and it
Uh,
seems to be that the unique actual future has to exist in some capacity in order to him to have this knowledge.
mhm.
Just by the basic
Yeah.
definition of knowledge, right? Like the knowledge we're talking here in God is not like when the Bible says that Abraham knows that if he goes to Egypt with Sarah, they're going to see that she's beautiful and they're going to kill him and they're going to take. Yeah, he knows that's going to happen in the future, but that's a different type of knowledge than what we're talking about with
Mhm.
God. We're talking about unfalsifiable, definite, exhaustive knowledge of the future, which
Mhm.
this future has to exist in some capacity for him to have this type of knowledge. It has to correspond to something.
Mhm.
So you talk a little bit
Yeah.
about a modal collapse. What is that?
Oh, that's that's an objection that's frequently raised against a classical theism, particularly the idea of absolute divine simplicity. Um, and it can be framed as a dilemma for the proponent of absolute simplicity. So, uh, w- like what you hear from folks like Aquinas and others, God knows everything that happens in creation in virtue of knowing his own essence, right? Well, wait a minute. God's essence is metaphysically necessary. And so if all of this information about the the details of creation history is somehow in God's essence for God to, come to know it simply by inspecting, or introspecting his own essence. Well, then that information has got to be metaphysically necessary, just like God himself is. But then that means everything's metaphysically necessary. There just is no contingency at
Yes, so
all.
we are co-necessary with God because if God had the volition, the will to actualize alternative futures, that adds parts to God, it adds potentiality to God. God's no longer
Mm-hmm,
simple. God's
mm-hmm,
gaining knowledge in some capacity. Um, and so, because the whole future actually exists in some capacity, and because God can't gain new information and everything about him is necessary, and this knowledge set is part of that, we're co-necessary. I think
yeah.
this is a great argument, and
The
it doesn't seem to make any converts, though, when you point it out to these people that
Yeah, the alternative side of the dilemma, I think, for the classical theist is, so if information about the details of creation is internal to God, if it's intrinsic to God, then by absolute divine simplicity, that information is identical to God's essence and metaphysically necessary, and so you get a modal collapse. The only way around that, it seems to me, is to say, okay, all this contingent information is extrinsic to God, right? You have to put it outside God, but then God can't know that stuff simply by knowing his own essence, right? Because it's not included in his essence; it's just not there. Uh, so what you get is a God more like Aristotle's God of thought thinking itself, a completely self-absorbed God who can only thinks about himself and has absolutely no clue of any contingencies going on extrinsic to himself. God is completely indifferent to creation. Uh, Now I don't know how you can I mean, how a Christian could hold to that view, because it seems to me, when John 3:16, God so loved the world. Well, you can't love the world and be absolutely metaphysically indifferent to the world at the same time. It's just those just don't jibe. And I think the classical theist, the one who affirms absolute divine simplicity, is really stuck on the horns of that dilemma. They
Right. And
cannot
so,
make sense of metaphysical contingency. Either everything is necessary, or God is completely indifferent to any contingency that is there.
right. So
Uh,
James Duezel in his book, I pointed this out in my last open theist debate. He appeals to divine mystery. He says the workings of a God who can freely choose between different worlds is basically just a mystery. And so that's what they have to do to try to get around this. But I
yeah,
don't think,
and that's just a cop out at that point, really, because
yes,
he's not addressing the issues that the argument raises. He's just waving it off,
he says
with
that it
with
has
a
to be
word.
true because I believe
Yeah.
this thing is true and I believe this thing is true. And then they have to coexist. So it doesn't matter how contradict, it's just a mystery.
Hmm.
So that's interesting. So we talked a little bit on Facebook Messenger about fatalism and what that entails. Now, the
Hmm.
Jews at the time of Josephus, they had a type of fatalism which was like a contingent fatalism. Like someone might be a murderer or somebody might be fated to die at certain. It's all the events leading up to that activity, including that activity, are not fated. God could fate a murderer to die at a future time after the person murders, because
Hmm.
that person made the choice, and then God fates that. But that's
Yeah.
different than modern notions of fate. And modern notions
Yeah.
of fate in metaphysics depend on this unique actual future existing, which must occur rather than ad hoc events being forced to a conclusion in real time.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think uh, the I think there are two different types of fatalism that you can find in ancient Greek thought. Uh, One is kind of more like the modern sense that you find in the Stoics. They had these arguments that they would offer, like the master argument. I think the guy's uh, name was Diodorus Chronos. We only have fragments of the argument, and people have tried to piece it together in all sorts of ways. But it's supposed to be just this purely conceptual argument for universal determinism, right? That's fatalism in the strong or the global sense, right? Everything is fixed. Then you have a different kind of fatalism that's closer to what you're describing, that you see in uh, like the story of Oedipus. It was there was a seer who told his father, "Hey, your son is going to grow up and kill you one day." And the father says, okay, I'm gonna try to head that off." And so he sends his son, off to live somewhere else. And eventually, however, the son grows up and by accident kills the father. Uh, Now, what seems to be going on there is that there's a certain outcome that has been fated by the gods, namely that Oedipus is going eventually to kill his father. There's no indication that all the steps along the way are fated, right? That exactly how he winds up killing the father is fated. So you could imagine lots of degrees of freedom in how we get there, but we're going to get there, right? To That's not global fatalism. That's more like a kind of local fatalism, right? It's like you could imagine a person uh, like right now, like has a brain aneurysm, that's just set to pop. It may be that they are fated to die at like 3 days from now.
Mhm.
That doesn't mean that they have no freedom how to live their life between now and then. right?
Yeah.
They can
So
do all sorts of things, but something's going to happen in 3 days due to the causal, things going on in their brain, and it's going to result in their death. So
it
some
seems
things can be determined without everything being determined.
right. It seems that opponents of open theism basically agree with the fatalistic model in which events that are fated to occur are are contextual. Like everything on Earth has to be in a set position during that event's occurrence. And so you'll find
Mm,
arguments like they'll look at Daniel 11 and say, oh, it talks about these future rulers doing these certain things.
hmm
Therefore, the entire future must be set. It seems almost like a non sequitur unless you're in the mindset that that event being described has a contextual place and the entire world has to be in a certain position while that event occurs, and that
uh-huh.
somehow is in the mind of the author rather than these localized fatalisms.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right. One thing that I think feeds into that criticism is the mistaken idea that creaturely freedom is a kind of all or nothing thing. That if we are free, then we are sort of, uh, you know, uh, in the libertarian sense. Then all throughout our conscious lives, we are libertarianly free with everything we do. And if you think that, then you might think, well, there's just too many degrees of freedom in creation for there to be any certainty at all that these events are going to play out as predicted in certain scriptures. And so the only way these predictions are possible is if God is uh, micromanaging things. If he allows that one rogue molecule out there, that little thing can set off a chain reaction, like the butterfly effect that just totally screws up God's plans. And so we can't allow that. And so, it's, uh, and I, so one thing to challenge there is just to say, well, it's just false that libertarian freedom is this kind of all or nothing thing that you either always have it or you never have it. Uh, I think I'm a restrictivist when it is the technical term. Uh, I believe we are libertarianly free some of the time, but not all the time. I think we are, to a large degree, creatures of habit. We often just do what we do kind of subconsciously without really thinking about what we're doing, without choosing in any conscious way to do otherwise or to not do otherwise. I think we've all, uh, or most of us, at least I have, had this experience more than once where I've been kind of daydreaming when I'm driving home from work or something, and I get home and I realize I don't remember stopping at any red lights,
Yeah, you just
gaining
teleport.
traffic at all, but somehow I avoided all those obstacles and got to my destination. But I was zoned out. I was thinking about something else.
Right.
Uh, I wasn't, I think, consciously choosing, okay, now I'm going to make a right turn. Now I'm going to take a left. I was just going by habit. Uh, and I wouldn't call that a libertarian free choice. I would say there I'm operating more like a compatibilist. I'm not being externally compelled to do the things I do, but I'm not choosing to do these things. But there are times in my life where I think we are very deliberate and conscious. We consider the pros and cons, and there, uh, I think our freedom has got to be libertarian if we're to make sense of that at all. Um,
Yeah.
so if creatures are largely creatures of habit, then I really don't see the problem with God being able to predict these kind of large scale developments in history, because
Yeah, there's a whole site, Predict It, where people fairly accurately predict world
yeah,
events in mass.
uh, yeah, it's like the psychohistory type concept from the Isaac Asimov.
The
Uh,
Foundation series.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, the Foundation series. You know, if you give like a large enough aggregate of people, and you know enough about their dispositions and their nature and stuff, you can make some pretty reliable predictions. You know, and in fact, about how things are going to shape up over the years. In fact, this is how the insurance industry works and stuff like that. You know, it's you don't need to determine everything in order to have very high degree of confidence uh, in kind of the macro development of human history.
And it helps if you're powerful. I always in debates like to bring out very early and point out that John the Baptist, he's confronted by these Pharisees who thought God's trapped by his plans, and he says, don't you be secure in being children of Abraham? Don't you know God could kill all of you and raise new children of Abraham from the rocks and thus fulfill his promise? God's smarter
Mm-hmm.
than us, so he could get things done, and even
Mm-hmm.
events that he promises going to happen, he can do things,
Mm-hmm.
and people just discount that. So we're at about an hour. I would like to do one more thing before we go, is go
Mm-hmm.
over one of your logical syllogisms. Well, this is the
Okay.
one we were talking about very early, where it's like, I don't know if you needed step four. Seems fairly obvious, but you go through
Yeah,
it and you
I got to
explain.
convince people.
Yeah. And so
Or
this
the
is what we're talking about. And I brought my kids, and like at the first reading of it, it's like they're not getting it. And so then I changed all your propositions with random other ones to show them how it works. And then they started understanding how the form and the flow went. But there is a
okay.
future contingency in creation. Future is causally open, and that's the
Uh,
premise. If there is a
yeah.
future contingency in creation, then either thorough thoroughgoing open futurism is true or preventable futurism is true. And so what's the difference between thoroughgoing open futurism and preventable futurism?
Okay. Okay. So the way I argue for the second premise there is I have a discussion of fatalism, and the way I approach it is uh, is to essentially ask, what are the minimal assumptions one would need in order to generate a valid argument for fatalism? And it seems to me that there's only two assumptions you need. One, uh, the way I articulate the notion of fatalism, or like the global fatalism, or, you know, the across the board fatalism, not just kind of the particular fatalism like the Oedipus case, uh, is to say there is a unique way the future is going to go, and there's nothing that anyone now can do about it, right? That so if there's a unique way things are going to go, that's just a unique actual future, right? It's I also use the term of a future specifier. There exists something that picks out or specifies a particular future, a particular continuation of history as the actual future, or, you know, the future that is going to be actual. Um, the other assumption you need in order to get the fatalistic argument to work is to say there's now nothing anyone can do about it. In other words, that future is unpreventable. Um,
Yeah,
and there's a
even by
lot of
God.
people, yeah, and so there's a lot of people who think you can uh, uh, deny the well. Me before I go there. Uh, so what I argue is that if you grant those two assumptions, right, that there is a unique actual future, and that whatever it is that specifies that future, that picks out which future is that the unique actual future, if the existence of that thing is now unpreventable, then that gives you all you need to construct a valid argument for fatalism. And so if you're going to resist fatalism and affirm future contingency, then you have to reject one of those two assumptions. If you reject the first assumption, which says that there is a unique actual future, and you just say, well, no, there just isn't, then you're an open futurist. You're somebody who thinks, who just rejects the claim that there exists anything that specifies a unique continuation of history as the future. If you reject the other premise, which says that, well, okay, you say, yes, there is this unique actual future, but it is preventable, then I call you a preventable futurist. So, and because the fatalistic argument only allows for room for those, only depends on those two assumptions, we get the third claim here that, well, again, if there is future contingency and so fatalism is false, then either thoroughgoing open futurism is true or preventable futurism is true. One or the other has got to be the case. I want to show that open futurism is true, so I've got to exclude preventable futurism. That leads me into a fairly lengthy argument, which we probably don't have time to walk through. But the gist of my
tell the audience what preventable futurism is, and I think inherently they're going to understand that it's false. It's basically Molinism.
Actually, closer to Ockhamism. So the standard example of preventable futurism is the William of Ockham's idea that, and today it's there's a variation on that people are calling the dependence theory. And basically what it says is that, God has always known what you are going to do at a particular point, what choice you're going to make. But it's still preventable because you have the freedom to choose either of your options. And if you had chosen the other option, the one that's different from what God has eternally known, well, then God would have eternally foreknown otherwise. So that by the choice you make now, as it were, you determine what God has eternally foreknown. Right? That's kind of like a backward type of causation, right? Where what God foreknows about the future depends upon what choices creatures make here and now. And so it's the
but he knows them before they make them.
Yeah, but it's the actual occurrences of those creaturely events that inform God's foreknowledge. So there's a kind of a backward explanatory process here, right? It's the creature, it's your free choice explains God's having the foreknowledge that he always has about your free choice. Now, what I want to argue is that preventable futurism, while it looks on paper like it can reject the fatalistic argument, I think is metaphysically incoherent. And I'll just try to give a kind of an analogy to illustrate why I think it's incoherent, rather than walking through my longer argument that I spell out. So I think preventable futurism is committed to two claims that cannot both be true in a kind of unqualified or absolute sense. So one claim is there is future contingency, right? There are multiple ways the future really could go from here on out, right? You have free will, right? You can go this way and you can go that way. And it's really up to you. That's the first claim. The second claim of preventable futurism is there is it is eternally determinate exactly how the future is going to go, which means it's eternally determinate exactly how you're going to choose at every point in your life where you have a choice. So if that or if the second claim is true, in other words, there is this eternal, uh, there is this kind of complete true story of creation that's there from the get-go. That at the instant God flips on the creation switch, he's got this information. It's just all there all at once. He knows the whole sequence of events in creation history. Well, then I need to say that from the God's eye perspective, all of this information eternally exists. It's always already there, right? In God's mind. Um, but if you say that there's future contingency and that what information is eternally in God's mind depends upon the choices we make here and now, then you're really saying that that information is itself a future contingency. Because if I choose, like if I have a choice of chocolate and vanilla ice cream, if I choose vanilla, then I bring it about that it has always been such that this complete true story of the future is a vanilla story. Whereas if I choose chocolate, then I bring it about that it has always been that this complete story is a, say a chocolate story. But then since the future can go in either of these two ways, and it's up to me, and the content of that complete true story is also up to me, at least in that particular. And so it becomes a future contingent as to which story of the future is the eternally true story. But if that's the case, that story can't both be eternally the case and itself be a future contingent, which it has to be if it's explanatorily dependent upon the actual choices we make here and now. And so, to use an analogy, it's like saying that on the one level, the whole story of creation is finished, it's complete, it's been published. The book is on the table, right? And if God shares it with us, we could read the book, and see exactly how the story ends. On the other hand, when you're saying that there is future contingency, you're saying that by the choices I make right now, I am writing the book. I'm choosing at least the bits and pieces of it that I have responsibility for. I'm choosing what goes into the book at those points, and all the other the creatures around the world who have any sort of freedom at all, they're choosing aspects of that story. So either the book is eternally complete and published, so to speak, or it's still being written. It can't be both, right? And so I think there's an inconsistency at the heart of preventable futurism. They want to say it's still being written because there's future contingency. You're free to do what you want. But they also want to say the story is eternally there and settled. It's all done, published.
Right. I think it goes back to what I was saying, that if there's no probability of something happening, then it's not possible. It's impossible. It's not a possibility. And so you can't have a set future and an open future at the same time. A truth value can't exist for future actions, and those actions be variable, contingent.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I do think it's logically sound. I just thought it was funny. It's like, well, we could probably just skip this. It seems almost intuitive, but it makes a lot of sense why it's put there. All right. So, do you want to tell everyone where they could find your book? Your book, I believe, is free until the 8th. Is that the case?
March 8th. Yeah. If you don't have it, I can give you the hyperlink.
I posted it in the chat. I'll put it in the description as well.
Yeah. If or a person could just search up for the Cambridge Elements, and you'll see a website for that, and you can go there, and look for the ones that are recently published, and you should see mine there. You might have to scroll down a little bit because every day they're publishing new ones. But
And if people don't get it now, then it's going to cost like $80 or something, or is that the physical copy?
for the print copy, the paperback is going to be, I think, $22. It's already listed in Amazon. There's also going to be a hardcover, which I'm surprised to me, and that's like 60 something. I don't
I think it's like
necessarily.
80. I think I just pulled it up somewhere. And
Oh,
it's
yeah,
in the
that's
guy's review. Patrick Todd's review. He says that $80. Does that make sense? No. Oh no, that's your commentary. Oh, that's his book is $80. Yeah,
yeah.
that's where I saw that number.
So, but the price is listed on Amazon if you should want to purchase a print copy. Those should be out, I think, near the end of March, is what they're telling me. So, or get a free copy now as a PDF. It's not a long book. One should be able to read it in a couple hours or so. But I think I do a pretty good job. I do hope in the not too distant future, maybe in the next 3 or 4 years, to try to do a longer book on open theism that can explore some of the issues I wasn't able to deal with in this book. In particular, the practical ramifications of open theism and other models of God. I think that's really important, but I had to cut it out because I was under a very tight word count limit, and I was going to go over if I tried to include that. The other
Right.
thing that I really wanted to spend quite a bit longer on was the problem of evil. I've got a fairly extensive argument that I've developed in some of my published work, where I argue that open theism really gives us the best overall response to the problem of evil. I think theistic determinism, aka Calvinism, and Molinism, and process theism, I think all they have different resources when it comes to addressing the problem of evil. But I think they all fall short when compared to open theism in that regard. But that takes some laying out, and I just didn't have the space to do that.
Yeah, it definitely feels like the most intuitive. We all experience presentism. We all experience the ability to make volitional choices. We can't travel into the past. We can't travel in the future. None of that makes sense. So our day-to-day experience is an open theistic model of the world. I think you need to have extraordinary evidence to contradict our normal experiences in order to make those viable arguments. So I think our default definitely, like I can't disprove a model that states that aliens are intercepting all of my brain waves and feeding me false information about even this conversation. I can't falsify that model, but it's not a probable model. It's not the model that we're experiencing. It's more probable that my senses are accurately describing what the data around me, my environment, and that should be our default view.
Yeah. I think we should start from the common sense position and depart from it only as experience and reason kind of pushes us out of it. But you don't want to start in some hypothetical realm that's divorced from concrete reality.
Yeah. So how can people find you? You have your website, Rhoda?
Yeah, I have a website, l090.net. I do have a blog that I am at least relatively active on. Maybe about once a month I'll put something out there. I don't usually get a lot of feedback from people on it, but it's a way for me to try to coalesce some of my thoughts on various issues. My blog is titled Open Future because that's sort of the main theme of my thinking. What does the openness of the future mean? How can we argue for that? So I talk a lot about open theism, different models of providence, also some just general issues in metaphysics or sometimes theology. Yeah, feel free to check it out.
Sounds good. All right, so we'll close there. I think it's a good conversation. There's a lot in this that we skipped over. You talk about the history of open theism. You talk about objections to open theism. I'm surprised if I was writing this, and then one of the objections is it was basically like, oh, your security might not be as stable. I would just put moralistic fallacy, like 2 words, and then moved on to the next objection. But you spend a whole long time answering those types of objections. Like, well, really, this security model makes sense because of this, and it's not less secure than this. And so it is good. So there's a lot of stuff that we're skipping over just for time reasons. But it does, I think this is a valuable contribution to open theist literature. And so get it listed on John Sanders, his listing as soon as possible, so he can start pointing people towards this.
And if somebody wants to update the Wikipedia page to please make sure it's noted in there.
Yeah. Don't change the opening line, though. We need to keep it that open theism is the rejection of the synthesis of Greek philosophy and Christian theology. That needs to be the opening line. It triggers them something wild.
I think that's true as far as it goes, though I don't think that's enough to.
There's more sentences in the
define
paragraph.
Open theism. Yeah.
There's more, but it starts with that, and they get really mad about it. And so they don't like it. And so it's fantastic. But thanks for joining us. I think this was a good discussion. And we'll cut there. And I think I gave you last thoughts. Do you've got anything else you want to throw
out? No, I've enjoyed it too, Chris. Thanks you for the invite. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, beat everyone to it. So you're going to do some more interviews on the book, a couple more podcasts, and so I'll look forward to watching those as well. So if anyone has any questions or comments, put that down below on the YouTube page or start a thread in God is Open, the Facebook group. Dr. Alan Rhoda is a contributor there, and so he could answer all questions that anyone has about any subject. So even Shakespearean plays, he's an expert. So thank you for watching.
All right. Thank you.